Hello,
Victor
Freunde.
said, yeah, Victor said he might show up, by the way.
Nice work.
Thank you.
Hello, friends. Welcome to an uncoordinated API review where we all just talk at the same time. But that's okay. That's how the meeting usually goes. Um, for those of you who pay attention to the calendar doodad, you'll note that we currently don't have Thursday sessions. So if you want us to have more meetings, you need to open more issues. Right. I think first up. So I think we're skipping the read-only collections thing because it wasn't on your agenda, Emo.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Provide a configurable overload of memory cache entry options for the commonly used method get or create in memory cache extension. 92101. Those are words.
I think Adam is out, right? So who else can talk about this?
Idek, who's not here. All right. Moving it down the line. Okay. A more granular X509 certificate loader. I guess that's me. Okay, so right now in .NET, if you want to load a certificate, basically everything goes through new X509 certificate 2. We have a couple different constructors, but they all just take bytes or a file name and they look at the file and they figure out what it is they're supposed to do, or the contents. They'll figure out what they're supposed to do, and then they do stuff. This has a couple of issues that have manifested over the 20 years it's been this way, and one of which is that it can cause you to not be in compliance with a protocol. So you expect something to say, like, this is just a plain certificate, but if somebody sends something that sort of kind of looks like a certificate, the constructor will open it, and it'll be like, oh, I can figure out what to do with that, and now you're reading data you shouldn't have, which leads to different implementations across various different behaviors across implementations, which is usually not a good thing in the internet ecosystem. And then, as we'll see with a big pile of options down here and a thing in the bottom, the PFX, aka PKCS12 file format, has a lot of expensive work it can do, and maybe you need to have opinions about how much work you're willing to do when somebody sends you a file. So the main purpose of this proposal is to break apart the do everything function into, you have to tell me what kind of file format we should be receiving, and we'll process that. And if you're wrong, you'll get an exception. There is still an API that will tell you what kind of file something is. So if you want to write the do everything function, you can do switch off get content type and then call back into the appropriate ones of these. But going with the specific method group per file format kind is the path forward. Okay. So the thing that should be the simplest, but is actually the most complicated because it doesn't have a very good name, is also should say, this is expected to be something that we want to make available for .NET Standard, and as such, it can't go on existing types. So we're expecting this to be something we put in Microsoft BCL cryptography as targeting Net Standard, in box and Net 9, obviously, and but yeah, so it's a sibling type, and right. So the simplest of certificates is called a certificate. The spec that it comes in calls it certificate. Some people call it X509. We call it X509 certificate 2 for reasons. So this is the first method is actually the one that probably needs the most love in naming.
are you looking for feedback on the name?
Right. At some point, it was proposed as load certificate. At some point, it was proposed as load x509. Currently, apparently, it says load x509 certificate.
I think I'd like to hold off on naming feedback until I see all of them, because I don't understand what the distinction is being made between certificate and cert in the next one, for example.
Fair enough. So the first format is loading the x509 public key certificate. It is the thing that is the certificate. The thing when you're doing TLS, the server says, "This is me." It's that format. Serialized cert. Here, I guess I can show where all these names actually come from. Serialized cert is the file format that Windows stores things in their version of the persistent certificate store. It's take the certificate plus any associated metadata it has with it, save it in their undocumented proprietary format, and export it. The fact that we can already export it and import it in the constructors is the only reason it's here. But this one's Windows only. You can also, given something signed with Authenticode, ask what the certificate is associated with the first signer of the payload, which is usually the only signer of the payload, but still, you can get the signer of an Authenticode payload. There's a file format loosely called PKCS7, and it's the same as the Authenticode, except it's not looking for a Windows PE file. This is also used for collections. So if you just have a bunch of certificates and you want them as a collection, usually it's saved as a PKCS7 bundle. So you can load that as a collection. I also have loading it into a collection here. Serialized store is an entirety of the Windows persistent store, Windows undocumented private file format. And then PKCS12 is when it has a different shape than everything else because it has these loader limits that we'll talk about in a moment. But the basic shape of the simple file formats is just give me some bytes or tell me where to go look, and the method group is what file format it is.
Is it fair to say that you basically took the enum, prefixed the members of load, and then effectively gave it a shape that makes sense for this particular format?
More or less. On the case of like PKCS7, I had to break apart what the behavior it is if you say new X509 certificate 2 versus X509 certificate 2 collection.import, which is why this one is primary signer and this one is embedded certificates. But yeah, that's more or less. It's the enum prefix with load.
Yeah, I guess my question is like, why don't we just have one load method that takes the enum and then the three things, right? The byte array, the span, and then the path. But for some operations, it doesn't make sense, it seems, because you have different shapes there. You take more arguments.
When we hit PKCS 12, aka PFX, things will definitely get different. The simple ones could be collapsed into, do you want the one cert function or the collection function? But once we were breaking them apart, just the other reason for breaking it apart is with the enum approach, there's no good way to say these functions don't work on particular OSs. So the Authenticode and serialized cert and serialized store are Windows only. I mean, we could mark the enum members that way, but that's a little wonky. The thing that doesn't work is loading them or saving them.
Right.
But
And then one other question I have is like, presumably this is only ever going to support one direction because you put it on a type called loader. Like, aren't there like equivalent operations that go the other way? That basically say like, take a start that I have and put it somewhere. Wouldn't you want similar behaviors there?
Well, there is an export routine already.
yeah. So export already exists on X509 certificate, it takes the enum. That's why the enum exists. Um, it's and it similarly exists on the collection type.
And like, there's literally no other options. You just basically get always a flat byte array back.
Yep. The only option is if you're doing PFX, what's the password? Because in particular with PFX on Windows, we just send the via PFX and the password down to the OS, and all the options that are then talked about here are Windows choices. But
And we would never just want a file name or, a span. Like, it's just, you get a byte array. They better like it.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's fine, honestly. Like this is certainly not a perf thing. Like you're not going to save any time really by writing to a span. And file name, like, you could always just call file.write all bytes yourself. It's just not a big enough scenario that we've seen.
yep. Many of these file formats it's hard for a sane person to predict how big the file would be. So letting the dynamic buffer size things do their job and then come back and just say, like, this was the answer is about the best you can do.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what we're doing under the covers anyway. I mean, we could take in an iBuffer writer, but like that's not a type that we commonly expose through APIs like this.
Yeah, the protocol compliance issues and the security bugs come from loading. Saving is nobody's really complained about saving. So
Yeah, the only thing that, I guess, if we ever find that we want to do something out of bandwidth saving, then, this type is not great because it's called loader. So you basically make the design choice that you never put anything on it. So we would have to invent another type, which seems unfortunate. But
to be honest, I would probably do extension methods on the certificate type anyway, as overloads of export, perhaps, if we wanted to change how export takes place.
that's fair, but I would say that doesn't take away what I'm saying, because this is a static type. So presumably you could put those methods here. It just would be weird to have an export method on a type called loader. I mean, it's not impossible, I guess, but and it goes back to the the wonkiness of names in crypto, I guess. But like, I don't have a better choice. I mean, like, I don't know, like,
I also
509 certificate formats. I don't know, like, you could put it something like that, right? But
yeah, I have trouble imagining a case where we would enhance save and care to send it down level.
Agreed.
Like, if we didn't care about net standard 2.0 with this, it would just be new static methods on X509 certificate 2. And so if we wanted to change export, we would change it on X509 certificate 2 or X509 certificate and call it a day. So this is just the throwing things backwards problem.
And usability wise, you don't care that you work with X509 certificate 2 most of the time, and then you have to go back to the other one to call the static export method.
Export's an instance method.
Ah, okay.
It's
So it
instance
shows up on
method
both.
on the single cert, and it's a instance method on the collection type.
Yeah, these are all factories that we're looking at here.
Yeah, well, that's fair, I guess. So
Yeah.
then, all right, then I guess we're happy with the name. I mean, I think, at least from my point of view, like, I'm happy with the conventions. Like what you said earlier about the file path. I mean, if we care enough, like, we can probably have the file name once. But if we also say the only thing you have to do is, like, provide a stream or something, and then I guess that works too.
Right. So I mean, the three couplet that I have here is because this is what the current constructor pattern looks like. You have the file name, the file name, the byte array, and I thought we had a span one somewhere. Maybe it's on the derived type. But Yeah. So this is what we have right now. It's new X509 certificate 2 of bytes or of the file name. There, on Windows, there are differences between the two, which is annoying and stupid, but it is what it is. All right. So now the complicated piece is the PKCS12 file format, also known as PFX, because on that one we need the data, the password that I'll just say is encrypted with, and then we have the key storage flags problem, and then now there's this new thing that's being added in this proposal called PKCS12 loader limits. So this is really just the span explosion of what's going on. It's load PKCS12 with the ways we can input things. Oh, I guess consistent with the other things where it can be a collection or not. These are load PKCS12 as a collection, and then most people do just the single certificate. So then it needed a different name, so it's single certificate. But we can come back to all this naming after we also talk about the PKCS12 loader limits. So in all of the things that take a PKCS12, they take a defaulted loader limits. These functions will always interpret it as this singleton of defaults, and which is going to be the same behavior as if you say new. And there's another shared version called dangerous no limits, which is let whatever the underlying tech is do whatever its internal limits happen to be. So it's a little bit of a lie. There are still some limits. They just may be effectively no limit. And there are a whole bunch of different settings that can go on in a PFX. There's the MAC that is mostly used to check if you got the right password before trying to decrypt anything. It has a work factor associated with it. Every individual thing that's encrypted has a work factor associated with it. We've included here what's the total amount of work you're willing to do. So if 300,000 is the per item, if everything did it with our default limit of 1 million, you're limited to 3. But usually the number's like 2,000 on these things. I think some places or some libraries have started raising it since that number was picked in the 90s. Then there's a maximum number of keys you want to look at, a maximum number of certificates you want to look at, a whole bunch of options that can be specified inside the file that can screw up your file system if you didn't expect them, or they make your file system happy if you did expect them. Do you expect a non-standard looking file format? Do you want to ignore everything with a private key and just load the public data? And do you want to ignore anything that's encrypted and only load what was not encrypted? These are the gist of the things.
Do we care about the defaults? Are they relevant for the discussions?
Not,
right?
Not really. I just included them here to give an idea of the order of magnitudes we're talking about.
And you would presumably reserve the right to change them, right? They're not something we expect you to rely on, right?
Right. Like I think the number I picked like for max keys and max certs is Windows 7's default limit in the OS function, and I don't remember if they've changed it since Windows 7. But so it was like, I don't know, they have a default, or they have a default limit, so we'll have a default limit.
Yeah, and we can consult with their experts too to kind of get these numbers where they should be.
And then this thing is not like stashed away, right? It's just read doing the load operation, right? And as soon as the method returns, you can mutate this thing freely, right?
These two there will be a private read-only state that these two will block access to any of the setters, but if you have your own instance, then yeah, you can call load, you can change the setting, you can call load again. If you want some nice undefined behavior, you can modify it while the concurrent load is in progress.
Yeah, those ones I don't care. Like, I mean, that's true for almost anything we have. And presumably init doesn't make sense. I mean, do we care?
That's I thought we weren't allowed to use init if something was going to net standard, and
I mean, I guess I actually don't know how init is emitted.
I know it counts
I
as just a
guess
set, and I think it's a set with an attribute, but
Doesn't it have a mod rec so down level compilers couldn't use it?
I don't remember.
I think you're right. It's mod rect.
Yeah.
Well, related though, I have a question. How do I? Is the default constructor on this type, the parameter list constructor, basically just pre-populating it to defaults?
Yep.
Okay, great. So if I wanted defaults and only changing one value, new limits,
right.
A equals B. Okay.
Yeah. Default.
Perfect.
The default singleton is basically new PKCS12 loader limits dot make read only.
Okay. Is there a magic thing that we have to do in order to make the with keyword work in newer versions of C#?
That's with a record. Somewhere in there, I further commented on that down there. I said, like, in an ideal world, this would be a record where we could do like with, so you can just like take an existing instance and then add with to just change that one thing you care about. But I could not figure out a way to get that to work in that standard 2.0 world.
Okay. If we didn't have to bother with net standard, is that something we would even be considering here anyway? It sounds like the answer was yes, almost.
I know that normally when a record comes up, Steve asks the question, "Do you want all the associated baggage?" And somebody says, "What associated baggage?" And he says, "So no." And so I don't know. I don't know what's required for the keyword with to work.
Okay.
I know it's not being a record, or sorry, I assume it's not being a record, but there may be some work that could be done that would make it look more like a record.
Then
there's some internal methods that get generated as a record called like a copy that lets it copy it and stuff like that. So I don't know if you can make it quack enough like a record that you can get it working. But that also led to like another question, since we were talking about records and all of their baggage. Does it make sense for this loader limits to implement any kind of equality? Is anyone going to write code that says like, oh, this is the default, or oh, this is the, dangerous do whatever, or is reference equality enough?
I think effectively reference equality is enough.
Yeah, because if we start adding stuff like collections onto this in the future, like what does an equality check over a collection property mean? It kind of binds our hands.
I mean, you can define it, obviously, right? You can always say it's structurally equality, right? But it's like, I mean, for options, I can kind of see why you would want this, but
yeah,
for those kind of things, I don't know. Like, because I mean, do we really expect people to like, I don't know, like define their own, like, I don't know, my app loader limits and then they initialize it once? I don't know. Like, I probably just new up the type and the location where I call load and then, forget about it again.
Yeah. One thing that I generally like to see for options classes like this is a constructor that takes an options instance. It's a copy constructor, basically. That way I can just confidently and easily say, I want this exact thing, but with one modification. The with keyword, basically.
Yeah, we can.
I mean, what I was thinking is
certainly add a copy constructor.
I mean, we could do copy constructor, but we could also just, instead of having these static things, we could just make them methods, right? And then it would just say, loader limits dot create defaults, and then you get your own instance and you just change it afterwards.
Or create from. Yeah, basically I want to modify, I want to make a change to an existing thing without modifying the original instance. The original instance might not necessarily be default.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the singletons are nice because, they don't allocate more.
I think just to contextualize it for some folks, I think 99.9999 in some variable number of nines of people are going to just use the overloads of these APIs that just use the default, which is null, which we say like, oh, if it's null, then go ahead and just, assume it's the default singleton. So I don't know that it's worth engineering the loader limits to be super customizable. I would be very surprised if any amount of people actually even instantiate this class themselves.
Oh, well, we have first-party partners who we know want this and who we know would tweak these things. Like I've been in contact with them. I don't know if what we're talking about with like copying stuff and then making modifications is something they want to do. It's just kind of like a thing that we generally consider when working on options APIs.
Yep. Yeah, I would expect, things like Key Vault to say they want to have that they're going to have opinions on how complicated of a PFX you can upload to them, and just be like, we have the static that we use for the whole Key Vault importing process, and like, if it throws an exception, then we reject your file.
Yeah.
How do they do that? Because presumably they want the same protection that you have, meaning you can't modify the static. How do they do that?
How do they do it today?
I mean, we can
No,
add
I
a
mean,
public
with
make
this-
read only on the type.
Yeah, that's what I was hitting at. Like you need some sort of thing to allow that then if you want that scenario. Which is also why I said like unless we think many people are doing it, I would just not go down that path and just replace those statics with factories. Because I mean I hear you what you're saying, but at the same time, like if you load the thing, I mean, do we really care about the allocation of this one type here? Is that really the thing that we're concerned about?
I mean, isn't the factory though the constructor? Like just new it up and then modify what you want? Like the default, singleton and the constructor do the same thing, except the singleton is just, a singleton for convenience.
Well, I mean, that's more like when you have multiple different kind of, like if you want basically defaults and dangerous no limits, let's say, well, how do you do this with a single constructor? You can say then the constructor with no arguments is the defaults one. And then how do you get the dangerous no limits one? I mean, at some point you would have to name it, right?
I guess if somebody wanted to start with the dangerous limits and then modify it later.
Yeah, that's usually like why I said like if we think, yeah, I mean, but I think you're right. I mean, we have, that's my general other question, like, do we want the dangerous no limits one at all? If the answer is no, then I would probably just get rid of defaults and just say you knew it up, and then we initialize it to some defaults, and then if you don't like them, you set them.
So I will push back against that. There are scenarios where you're reading something from config, for instance. Like I trust this PFX fully, and you don't want to run into a situation where we change some random default in the future, and all of a sudden your application just breaks. There needs to be a way for the caller to say like, this thing is fully implicitly trusted. Turn off all checks entirely.
But on that point, Levi, if someone couldn't someone be in that same situation where we changed default and they had previously only set 3 of the properties because those are the ones they cared about, and then we change one of the values for the other 15 and we still break them?
Yes, I'm not talking about scenarios where people are trying to protect against things that are being sent by arbitrary people. I'm talking about scenarios where like this PFX I generated myself and I need to load it into my application, like get out of my way.
I think he's just defending the shut up and do what the OS wants to do, aka dangerous no limits.
I'm actually going further and saying like, ideally no limits, honest to God, means no limits.
Well,
but ultimately we're bound by what the OS does. I know, but yeah.
We certainly could use our custom PFX loader instead of the Windows loader, but some of these things get complicated without deferring to the OS.
Yeah.
At which point their limits kick in.
So I'm not entirely sure what the thing is you're pushing back on, Levi. Are you saying you want just a way to have no limits?
It sounded like there was an argument being made to get rid of this property, and I don't think that's a wise decision. I think there's enough people who need this property that we should not get rid of it. Unless I misunderstood the earlier suggestion to get rid of the property entirely.
I mean, that was one question I had in chat. Is like, why do we need this? Do we think enough people are going to use it? Because to me, kind of like, if we think enough people are using it, it seems unfortunate to have in the first place. But yeah.
Well, it's a common enough scenario that when we released our CVE back in June or whatever it was, we actually had explicit documentation saying, like, we understand a significant portion of consumers need functionality equivalent to this. This is how you do it.
What happens if you pass loader limits null today?
So all of the functions that take one default it to null, and then basically inside its loader limits question mark equal loader limits dot defaults.
Oh, so null means default, not no limits.
Correct.
It would be safe by construction.
Null is I have no opinion, so do the defaults.
Gotcha.
Not make it work.
Yeah, I can see that. So I can see the argument that when you use dangerous no limits, you don't really want to tweak it. So having an immutable static is enough. I think with the defaults, the thing you'll find people want to fuck with it afterwards. They want to say, I want to take the default except this one thing.
Sure,
Or
but
the two things.
again, this defaults is just A, so you can inspect what the defaults are without doing it up yourself, and B, so when you're calling one of these things, we're not you passed null, so we allocated a thing on your behalf. We just use the shared instance. This will be equivalent to the I put it right here. It's just the default constructor, but then
Gotcha.
marked as you can't call any of the sets.
So then I think what you're saying is that we will only ever have these two, and we think we don't need a copy constructor because, well, you just new it up and set afterwards, because the only one you want to actually extend is the default, and that's the default constructor.
Yeah, I'm fine with adding a copy constructor and taking something like make read only and making it a public instance on it, and so that way Key Vault can have their limits, and if for some reason they want a thing that's I want the normal Key Vault limits except also let's turn preserve key name back on, then sure, copy that and change one setting. That seems totally fine to me.
That works for me. So you would have a protected make read only?
Well, protected would be no good on a sealed type, so it'll just be public void make read only.
Oh yeah, fair enough.
Oh, so you're suggesting having a public way to freeze this thing then?
I thought you suggested that from the like Key Vault scenario.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, how does a third party do that, right? It basically would mean that nobody can have statics except us.
Well, how did the JSON options work?
They freeze themselves the first time you pass them into a function.
Yeah.
So they don't have a public freeze, but you can side effect the freeze in.
And how do we
no, they
enforce
do
that?
they do have a public. Yeah, they have a public freeze function.
What they call it? Did they call it freeze?
Make read only. It just got added.
Make read only.
Got added in .NET 8.
All right, then that's what we do.
Yep.
And it's like void returning, right?
Yes. Yeah, read only capital R capital O. And then they have an is read only field as well.
And when you call it twice, it's fine, right? So it's not important.
I assume it does nothing if you call it twice.
Yep. Here we go. Full install.
Fire on.
Only thing is in the API RF, please add the public default constructor thing, because right now it looks like you can't construct it.
Yeah.
I guess once I add the copy constructor, then you can't. So. Okay. So that was these four things.
That sounds right. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Right. So all right, I guess this bundle of options in the loader limits is worth discussing because it has an extensibility problem. So, in a PFX, a private key, especially if it comes from Windows, can say if it came from Windows CNG or if it came from Legacy Cappy, and if it came from Legacy Cappy, which particular provider it came from in Cappy, and so that's the option that I've called here preserve storage provider. Generally, these days nobody wants it to be true because what they'll find is they load a certificate or they load a PFX that was created by an older system. It doesn't load it into CNG, and that's when they find that they can't do like RSA with SHA-2 signing. And it's like, well, get it to load in a better private key provider, and you'll be happy.
So I mean, I need to now ask them a question. Like, I mean, you export something, it makes sense to say preserve because I would think you best burn it into the data. But when you load, what does preserve mean in this context?
Don't ignore.
Like basically put it where it says it wants to be put. Is that kind of what it means?
Right. So the file inside the file, it will say this is the storage provider I should go to. We can ignore that, and we can tell Windows to ignore that. And so this is actually not ignore storage provider.
And then it goes to some default, or do you specify the other one as part of the load then?
If preserve storage provider is set to false, then it's do whatever the system thinks the best default answer is. So Windows 7 might still be Cappy. Windows 10 and 11, which are the only supported versions now, say BCNG.
Gotcha.
And on non-Windows, this option doesn't matter because we only ever have one provider per system. But Windows
We meaning
has
.NET, or
lots.
that's just how these systems work?
Both. So like OpenSSL when loading completely ignores this because it makes no sense to them. And Apple, I mean, I've not actually seen the code for their loader, but I can't imagine them doing anything with it. They certainly don't use it as like the name of the keychain to load it into. So this is really a Windows only option.
Sure.
Similarly, preserve key name. This is the whole purpose of a PFX is you take all the certificates that you've saved into the My Store on one computer and you copy them to another. That's basically what Windows invented it for. And so this is make it look identical on the new computer as it did to the old. So every private key has a name. Usually it's just a GUID. And this is when you import it, it should get the same name. This being set to true, which it's effectively true in our current default, is if you load the same PFX in parallel anywhere on the same computer. So this is not parallel in the process, this is parallel on the OS instance. There's a time of check, time of use with this key name is available, so I'll use it, and then two different instances create keys with the same name. The second one overwrites the first. This is all fine and well until you dispose one of those instances and you had it with .NET, and then we say, great, we didn't need the private key anymore, delete it, and now it disappears from the other process. And so in all of our SSL stream tests, we went through and cracked open the PFX and stripped these attributes out so that they were safe to load in parallel. And this is just, a thing that it's a Windows behavior that probably nobody ever wants. And so we're making the world better by making it off by default. There's similarly a thing that can be written in the file for the certificate alias, which I think on Windows comes back as the friendly name property, and it's ignored on the other OSs. And then, unfortunately, there's the any other piece of garbage that you felt like writing in the file. Right now, there's no other data that matters, but this option is here for we shouldn't strip it out before we send the contents to the OS. And Kevin had some ideas of like a hash set of OIDs to keep around, but that seemed complicated, and I left it with a boolean of anything we don't know about. This is the extensibility problem, because if we name a property in the future, it'll stop being unknown.
Yeah, I was about to ask, like, what does unknown mean here? Regarding the OID stuff, so in Windows, for instance, you can protect a certificate using a DPAPI NG protector, and that actually gets written out, I believe, as its own safe bag with its own special OID.
This isn't about the bags. This is about the attributes within the bag.
Right. But what I was getting at is, because I think it's related, a related problem. Like, right now, our behavior in our loader is that if we don't recognize the OID of a bag, we just die. We just throw an exception and say sorry, like the end.
No. An unknown bag type is just ignored.
No, that's in the loader that we introduced in June. When you have the defaults turned on, like if there's a bag that we don't understand, maybe a safe that we don't understand, like we actually throw a cryptographic exception. Like that's a behavior we introduced a few months ago. That's a security update.
I must have missed that in the code review, because that's wrong. Because any unknown type would just be like,
yes,
that's just garbage. Windows ignores it. Our Linux loader ignores it. Mac ignores it.
So that's the thing. There are certain OIDs that have meaning to the Windows loader that at the moment we reject. And I'm wondering if we actually need some type of functionality here to say, oh, if you see a bag or a safe with this OID, like, don't parse it, but don't reject it. Just let the underlying OS do its thing.
Right. So that would be sort of more in this bucket, because the prototype implementation I have for this, it loads encrypted keys, it loads unencrypted keys, and it loads certificates, and everything else it throws in the garbage.
Right.
Unless you happen to use the Sentinel dangerous no limits, in which case we'd never look at the file at all and we just send it straight to the OS. Sentinel, that's the one I wanted, not Singleton. And so, yes, there's technically room here for should we preserve unknown bags. Again, that only makes sense on Windows, because on Mac and Linux and probably all the mobile OSs, we interpret the PFX ourselves, and there is no tell us about things we don't understand, because we ignore them.
So out of curiosity, how do we version this API? So let's say we don't ship what Levi suggested right now, and we ship it later. Would that mean we couldn't really have quote unquote safe defaults then? Because presumably the default would then be we would by default ignore them, but well, that's a deviance from the previous behavior, right?
I mean, in general, the default would be do whatever we were doing previously. So, like, we shouldn't be throwing on contents in the PFX we don't understand, that are like tagged as a data type that isn't a key or a certificate. Like, we just straight up ignore them. If we need an option later, then it would be ignored by default, and then there's an option to turn it on. Dangerous no limits would turn it on, because it would be the get rid of the .NET filtering, and so that would be
fair enough.
That would be fine. It becomes weird when we stop having booleans and we start having like sets.
Right.
Policy is a thing.
Yeah.
Policy is always a thing that bites us in the end.
Yeah.
Does that we don't ship policy?
I mean, but here's the thing, right? We're
this
making
is one
an API that allows you to control policy.
Yeah, no, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But yeah, we always ship policy. That's the whole thing. What we do pretty much for a living. Yeah. So.
But right. So with this notion of unknown attributes, to my knowledge, aside from the fact that I missed certificate alias in the original proposal, to my knowledge, Windows has not added an attribute with semantic meaning since at least Windows XP. And nobody else cares about any of the attributes, so while this technically isn't future-proof, I don't expect it to change in our lifetimes.
You would still preserve critical attributes, correct? Regardless of the setting?
There's no such thing as a critical attribute. Certificates have critical extensions.
Yes,
but
okay, yes,
that's
you're right.
within a cert and not on the bag.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're correct.
Okay.
obviously.
Okay,
I like
yeah,
how
I don't.
things are named.
I don't have any problem with this API shape then. As long as the dangerous no limits sentinel is interpreted as turn off every single check, then I think we're okay.
Right. So, you know, it's a little bit of an implementation detail, and this is a little bit of, again, why this is actually makes sense to be a sentinel. If your input is reference equal to dangerous no limits, we just straight up call pfx import search store on Windows. It's like, great, we don't care. Do whatever it is that we used to do.
Yep.
Bypass all of our checking. Just jump straight in. It's effectively an API version of the app context thing to turn off the June security update.
Yeah, because that's calling that API straight up without cracking open the PFX is the only way to make the scenario I mentioned earlier work.
Right.
Where you have it protected with DP API, because like that format is undocumented, we cannot crack it open.
Yep. All right. So, yes, I threw in here an opinionated thing called allow multiple encrypted segments. If you care, a segment is an auth safe because the spec uses words. This doesn't correspond to a Windows option. This is just me saying a file you would expect should never have multiple of these. So let's be opinionated and reject them. And I think Kevin says I'm being too opinionated and wants to cut this member.
Well, I don't hate it. I just question the utility of it because, one, we already have work limits in place. Like, okay, there's multiple encrypted segments, but the KDF iteration limits are going to stop that from multiple encrypted segments or auth safes, whatever the right word is, from going haywire in the first place. I think it's just a little, what is the summary documentation for that one going to look like? And but to your point, I think the majority of cases, it's going to have exactly. Don't PFXs created by some systems, I think Windows usually have multiple encrypted segments by default because it will do the cert and the key. Windows on its little export certificate dialog thingy has a little checkbox called certificate privacy. I can't remember, and I don't have Windows in front of me. So it is pretty easy to end up in a situation where you have multiple segments that are encrypted for just one cert and one key.
Right. So this is where the word segments becomes foofy, and if I said auth safes, then it would match the file spec. It would match the RFC, but then no one would know what it meant. So Windows export and then OpenSSL's export looks like Windows XP's and Apple's looks like Windows XP's. They export two auth safes. The first one is plain text. The second one is encrypted, unless I have the order backwards. The encrypted auth safe contains the certificates, which are not encrypted. So they're plain text, but then the whole auth safe is encrypted. The plain text auth safe contains encrypted private keys.
Right.
So since the option is, should it ignore
shrouded key bags.
Right. Since the option is don't allow multiple encrypted auth safes, don't allow multiple encrypted things, the shrouded key bags don't count against this property. This is just at the auth safe ingestion. So you shouldn't ever see multiple auth safes that were encrypted using the Windows XP convention of how a PFX looks.
At a minimum, then, I would say that this should be like the actual correct term
auth safe
from because what is a segment? It doesn't appear anywhere in the PFX PDU.
Yep.
So when people are trying to figure out what does this mean, well, they're going to I have no idea. Does it mean safe bags? Does it mean auth safes? Does it mean shrouded keys? I don't know. But also, that just kind of sounds like, why do we need it if we have iteration limits?
Yeah,
That's fair.
It does seem duplicative.
Okay, and then ignore encrypted segments. this one. Oh wait, delegation. That's the key to success. Since I'm hosting the screen, Levi, can you look up a current copy of wincrypt.h? Because these last
Are you looking to see if those are public? Because they're not. I just looked it up last week.
Okay, they're not public and on MSDN.
Yes,
but they are
they're
public.
in the header file.
They are
They're in
public
the
in
header file,
wincrypt.h, and I don't remember what Windows calls this option. They've added it recently.
Yeah,
They have a
I'll
mode
look it
where
up.
you can load the PFX, but it will load. I think it will still load encrypted private keys if they're not in an encrypted auth safe.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
And
But
so
yes, you're right. There are two options for it.
I got it from there.
Yeah.
They literally use the word segments.
That's what I don't remember what it's called.
Give me a second. I'll get back to you.
But just for, since you brought up, WinCrypt, would we actually use the WinCrypt APIs for these, or because we couldn't if we wanted to make it work XPlat or on down level Windows. So that would just be whatever our reader's doing anyways, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean the implementation again. So to drag implementation into this, the way that this will work on Windows is if you're using dangerous no limits, we just call PKCS12 import with our default flags. Everything else is we're going to do a stage 1 cracking of the PFX of just like holding on to all the individual bags that we care about, and then glue them together and send them to the OS after we've passed all of our filters through. And so if we say something like ignore encrypted auth safes, we just won't tell Windows it existed. They'll never see the original file unless you pass dangerous no limits. Because the only way we can rip out the things like the key provider name and the key name and the friendly name is we're rewriting the whole PFX. The same as on Mac OS, where they only support reading of PFX that looked like it did in Windows XP, and so we have to normalize it to their representation. To the representation they expect.
Yeah, so in Windows they call it PKCS12 only certificates and PKCS12 only not encrypted certificates.
Okay.
So do you want to allow private keys, yes or no? And even if you want to allow private keys, do you want to allow any type of iterative work when importing the private keys? Is really how to interpret those two properties.
Right, but since they say encrypted certificates, you would only get an encrypted certificate from an encrypted auth safe, which means that they're ignoring encrypted auth safes.
Correct.
And I mean, we could call it ignore encrypted certificates to match them, but then there's a question of, are we cracking the auth safe to look for shrouded private keys that were encrypted within that? And I think I know what their implementation's doing, and I foofied the name. So
for symmetry, we could also call it ignore encrypted private keys, because you have ignore private keys right there.
But this isn't about the private keys. Right? If their option is ignore encrypted certificates, it's when the certificate required
yes.
decrypting instead of it was embedded plain text in the file.
No, you are correct.
Yeah. And so I think if you say ignore encrypted certificates true, but don't say ignore private keys, then they'll find plain text certificates and still unshroud private keys. So
sounds right.
Yeah.
And I know most of the people listening to this don't know or care what any of these words are, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right. So really it's Windows has decided to include a new option here. We should probably be forward thinking and be inspired by a thing we've seen in the header.
Yeah.
And come up with what we want to call this equivalent functionality. And again,
this naming might be okay.
And we can we can just say, fine, we'll replace segments and we'll call it auth safes, and we'll link to the RFC.
Yeah. The segments might actually be okay here because we're just ignoring anything that's encrypted.
Except shrouded private keys.
Yes.
We're we're letting the shrouded key bag go through because the key bag wasn't encrypted.
Right.
Its contents are. We don't know that. But yeah, that's where it gets foofy.
I'm I would need to dig into the implementation, but I'm pretty sure that they don't do any type of decryption whatsoever anywhere in the stack if you pass that flag in. But I would need to double check that.
Fair enough. I either guessed or looked and don't remember. I think that was just on their auth safe ingestion routine. Because once they're loading a shrouded key bag, that's just a PKCS8 load, and it looks different because it's buried.
Yeah. I'll look it up and get back to all of you. We don't have to rat hole on it for this.
Right, but so really the question is, yeah, segments, auth safe, certificates, doodads. Like, what do we want the last word in this property to be?
Doodads?
Components is something that we tend to use frequently. I think either Emo or Steve actually had like naming suggestions from earlier in the review anyway. So maybe that can all just be rolled together.
Like, sorry, naming suggestions for which part?
Anything that you've seen here.
I don't think anybody aside from the three of us have been talking about segments. So
yeah, I don't have any suggestions for things that are on the types because I don't even know what half this stuff means.
Okay, that's okay. Neither do we.
That's great.
Kevin?
I said items.
Oh.
I don't.
Again, that's where it gets weird because if the flag that we're trying to mimic from Windows is still loading shrouded private keys, items is even harder to defend if we're doing that same behavior.
Yeah, but it kind of sounds like we're using this for both auth safes and shrouded keys. So
I think it's just auth safes, and so maybe that's a piece of follow-up work. But if it's never do any encryption, then never do any decryption, then that's probably easier to name, which it would just be ignore encrypted items. But I think it's auth safes.
can we conditionally approve it as items if it's none and auth safes if it turns out it's only auth safes?
It's fine with me.
Yeah. I think conditional approval here would be appropriate.
Okay. Max certs should probably be max certificates because I don't think we abbreviated it to cert anywhere else in this.
Right.
We changed the one earlier on.
Did we have a cert? Oh,
Serialized
sorry.
cert.
Serialized
Yeah.
cert. Yeah. So that is the name we currently have in the enum, which is why it has that one.
I would prefer using certificates except for when we're actually intentionally trying to pattern match on the enum.
Yep.
Which is what we did with all the other APIs and overloads.
Why does the enum use cert? I'm just trying to understand why that's. Is there actually a special meaning to it being shortened like that?
I assume that's just what it was called in the header file.
I'd be more inclined to not pattern match the enum and just name these how we want to name these. So load serialized certificate so that everywhere it shows up here, it's certificate.
Yeah,
That's
I'm
just me.
pretty sure this is a serial. Somewhere in there, there's it's gonna be crypt decode object or something, and the file format type they're gonna have called it something underscore serialized underscore cert.
Yep,
And-
that's exactly what I'm seeing right now.
And that's where Brian Lamacchia got the name of the enum from.
Mm-hmm.
And if it wasn't you, Brian, I apologize.
But this also works on Linux and Mac, right?
Serialized cert is a Windows private form. I have no idea what it is. We're never
I
going to
see.
support it on anything other than Windows.
I see.
So that's why it's supported OS Windows.
Windows.
Yeah.
Similar
it-
I see.
with
All right.
Serialized
fair.
Store.
Yeah.
This is
I
Windows
am-
proprietary file format.
Yeah. I am seeing a lot of Windows proprietary stuff on here, or something that we're going to be directing quite a few people to. And I wonder if the Windows specific stuff actually should be under a nested class or something. Because otherwise, I think it's going to be confusing to people when they see like load X509 certificate and then load serialized cert. Well, what is my PFX blob if not a serialized certificate?
I would call it load Windows serialized cert.
Maybe it's just I don't like the idea of putting really uncommon things like this on the exact same type as siblings with really common APIs.
I mean, I think Morgan asked, why don't we just cut it?
Yeah, and
What was the
if
answer?
we were,
That sounds good.
So,
the answer is because the constructors that we have today can handle those formats. If we ever want to have a chance of deprecating the constructors that we have today, then we need to offer a path forward for those formats, regardless of how little they're used.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we can obsolete the constructors and still have them be functional.
Mhm.
It's what you're saying is if we ever wanted to actually make them throw not supported exception, then and we still believe that there was use of that particular code path, then sure, but we could also add them at that time.
I feel like in general that developers generally don't like it when they are put in a situation where they have no path forward for obsolete APIs.
But there's a reason it's obsolete, right? Do we expect people to be using this?
so
It's
the big problem
obsolete.
is we have a do everything function, so we have no idea if anyone's using it, but my expectation is no one's using it.
That's my expectation as well.
Then let's add it when we have proof that people need it.
Yeah, that's where I'm leaning, honestly. Because it's okay to tell people for now, like, oh, your scenario happens not to be covered by the new stuff. Like, suppress the warning and keep calling the old API. Meanwhile, that gives us an opportunity to add, like Steve said, the missing functionality.
Okay. I mean, certainly adding new method groups would serve us just fine in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
But
that's...
Are we just from a shipping perspective? Are we? How is this going to ship? Because that impacts whether we can add new members to the type.
Presumably, you can do something like what we do with system text JSON, where even if, say that you're targeting .NET 9, where this is inbox, and then we release a new API in .NET 10, presumably you would be able to override the inbox implementation with the .NET 10 out-of-band package.
As long as this hasn't been type forwarded.
I don't expect it would be.
So this is going to be in a new inbox assembly.
No, it would be type forwarded.
Why would it be type forwarded?
Because it'll live in system security cryptography and inbox and Microsoft BCL cryptography not, unless we make it be a complete side loader thing.
This sounds like a conversation we should pull Eric into then. Okay.
Yeah, because Microsoft BCL cryptography exists specifically. It's already type forwarding one type.
Yeah.
If it doesn't type forward, then we have to make an inbox package. I guess we don't have to, but if it's it's weird if we ever want to obsolete the constructors that, oh yeah, by the way, we've obsoleted these constructors, go get this other package that isn't inbox, which sounds weird.
Yeah.
If we are forced to inbox, Microsoft BCL cryptography, then I guess we can do that, but it's already type forwarding and we'd have to break that type forward, or it'd just be redundant because it would be inbox then. I don't know. X509 certificate loader too.
Yep.
I don't like you anymore.
Okay, X509
I'm
certificate
happy
2
you did
loader.
at one point at least.
This still seems like a tractable problem. But yes, it would require some clever packaging and API design, or maybe not API design, but just clever locations of where things exist.
Yeah, because I think all that we would have to do is, if we add something in, net 10, we would just, in the new package, which you would need to see the new member anyway, we would get rid of the net 9 type forward, and we would make a net 10 implementation that maybe is less ideal than the net 9 type forward would have been, but that still works because we have a thing that'll work on net 5. So
yeah. Also, we don't expect that we're going to have to change this all that often like we would do with system text JSON, so it might just not be a problem in practice.
Right.
So which part do you think is the problem in practice?
So let's say that we're missing a scenario and we have to add APIs to this in order to make that scenario work. Customers today are still not left in a lurch. They just use the existing APIs and suppress the obsolescence warning. Like, the functionality is still there in .NET 9, it would just be obsolete. But obsolescence can be suppressed.
Sure. Yeah, that one I care less about, I think.
Yeah.
I think the question is still like, so when we ship it out of band, right, and then we ship an inbox version in .NET 9, we still have to make sure that when you upgrade from 8 to 9, stuff continues to work, right?
Yes.
Right. Like, because if you
Maybe
got
it's a 9 to 10 story, that's more interesting. If we have to add something later.
Yeah, because if you were referencing the package
you need
with 8,
you need the inbox version to win, right? That's the point, generally speaking.
yeah. So the Microsoft BCL cryptography for net 9 would say resolve this type by a forwarding to system security cryptography. So like that's easy. You brought in the .dll when you didn't need to. Okay, but that's the way that our NuGet type forwarding systems work. Who cares? The only weird one is if in net 10 we say, oh, apparently everybody and their brother used serialized cert in .NET Framework, and now we're going to add this as a real member. That's when you get the like, well, now we've got to say net 9 no longer forwards inbox and go use this other thing. But if you built net 9 and didn't load this package, then you wouldn't see that there was a serialized cert option. You'd have to build net 10 and it's fine. Things are fine.
The other thing that's an option, I'm going to say it, and don't everybody swear at me all at once, is use a different package other than Microsoft BCL cryptography. One that we will never type forward and we can inbox, but doesn't type forward, and one that we can outbox for net standard.
We can do that.
How's it different from system text.json? That's the same thing for system text.json, right?
That is what system text JSON is doing, but Microsoft BCL cryptography already has a story for type forwarding. So I'm saying introduce a new package that doesn't type forward, which Microsoft BCL cryptography has already done.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So basically, what you're saying is make it a pure OOP, right? That just happens where the OOP ships in box, but it's the same identity, right? You don't have to type forward anything.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be, I think, preferable, because it basically makes it kind of like relatively safe by construction. It kind of just means the limitation you have is that whatever code you put in these methods, it lives in whatever assembly you put it in, right? And the assembly identity cannot change. Like as soon as you do say things like, oh, this list has to live in core lib now, that's when you kind of like make a commitment that, yep, there's no more an out-of-box version. Now it's a fully in-box assembly.
Yeah, that would make it very easy for us to add, load serialized cert or load other goofy format later on. We just add new members as we need to, and it's the same assembly identity, whether it's inbox or boot.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's unfortunate that it will be a one-type assembly, and that we just did work, which at this point probably means 3 years ago because time has no meaning, just did work to take system security cryptography from being like 7 assemblies down to 1. And now we're increasing that again.
Don't sell yourself short. There are 3 types in this assembly.
Oh, that's true. The loader, the options type,
Yeah.
and the exception.
Yeah, plus all of the compiler-generated infrastructure.
Oh yeah, there'll be like 30 types in this assembly.
Yeah,
There's going to be internal ones too, definitely.
yeah.
So
Okay.
And certainly this can be written in terms of just public API because we can just defer to the existing obsolete constructors to do our work after we filter here. But there's probably going to be reasons that we'd prefer to be behind the public shield. But if it makes more sense to be a totally oob
How
thing,
how
we
is
can.
this actually going? Are we going to have internals visible too into system security cryptography.dll, or how are you going to implement these APIs in a totally separate assembly?
The
the nice thing about system security cryptography today is it is a giant pile of partials. And I expect the implementation for this would be to just pull in the sources that we need for this package, because they're all under source common for things like that, and I would imagine that's how we would do that.
But we don't want. We've never let a NuGet package p-invoke into our shim library.
Well, I don't think we would actually do any p invokes into shims from the NuGet package. I think we would just run it through our loader limit checks and then eventually just call the obsoleted constructor with a suppression.
Right, but for when we look at the simple formats like load x509 certificate, if we're inbox, we would only call the, D to I x509 wrapper, because we would just wire it straight up to that one function. It either works or it doesn't. If we're sideband, then we have to call get content type and throw if it doesn't say certificate, and then call the existing constructor. So as a sideband, it's worse perf, but you're doing crypto. Who cares?
Also, doesn't our X509 constructor, doesn't it do the limits checking?
It does the limits checking if you call the constructor that takes just the byte array, but if it takes the byte array and the password, it turns off the limits checking because it's like, well, clearly you knew you were loading a PFX.
So we would use the one. So we would use the one that also takes the password, because otherwise we couldn't implement the ones that are no limit on top of the one that has a limit.
Right. So if you're calling load pkcs12, you gave us a password, and we're going to forward that on to the call.
Yeah, there is no
the
load
obsolete
PKCS12 without a password.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Oh yeah. So
Well,
we got rid
It
of
might
that.
not have a password, but you need to tell us that with a null or empty password.
Right. Yes. We got rid of the it'll foofy. Be like, oh yeah, I'll make up the empty thing for
But
you.
if you give us $1 empty password, we still call the one that has a password.
Right. Because it'll just say call load pkcs12 would be do filtering, and then say new x509 certificate. Well, actually, this would be x509 certificate to collection.import of our sterilized data, comma password, comma key storage flags.
Yeah, and shouldn't password also be nullable on those methods?
Yeah, I was going to ask, shouldn't it be null?
Because null and empty have
Yes.
different meanings. Yes.
It should be nullable but not defaulted. Yes.
Yeah.
Null and empty have different meanings. Wait, is it one of
They
those
do.
crazy APIs where we have different kinds of spans?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh God.
Because the spec itself differentiates between the non-existence of something and the existence of an empty something.
Yep.
Hooray!
Beautiful.
Yes. This is the example I always pull up when somebody says you should never need to know the difference between the null span and the empty span. And I say,
And
well,
I mean,
should never need to know the
you
difference
should
between
never
null
need to
span.
know the difference. Yeah, the spec is weird.
I have a
You should
spec
never
right
need to know
here that says null does this, if null do this, and if empty do this, and if neither do that. So
Who wrote that spec?
someone in Windows.
If you
If
you want
we'll-
the answer is Microsoft accidentally implemented it that way in like the late '90s and then spec'd it as that.
Yes.
Uh,
Spec by accident.
Probably true, yes. But I mean, when you're loading, because nobody understands the difference, the null and empty end up getting treated the same. It's just which one do we try first. So, if you're correct, you're faster, and if you have a password that's not null or empty, then we only try the one that you gave us.
So from a perf perspective, I know this generally isn't a super hot path, but what we've just said is the new preferred APIs are actually going to be slower because they're going to do all the validation twice.
All right, so there's multiple pieces of things. So if we're side loading, so if we're not building this in as part of system security cryptography in Net 9 plus, then these simple loader functions will have to do the crack the file type without loading work, and then call the omni function, which will do that work again and then load it.
Why will it do the work again?
Because that's how the omni function works.
But okay, so here's a weird one. What if load X509 certificate does the upfront check in the package and then uses the obsolete function that takes the password? Because today,
Yeah.
it's weird, but you
These
can
are
do
all
it.
tractable problems.
No. But
Yeah.
You can't.
if you call load X509 certificate and we don't throw because content type said it was a certificate, the PKCS 12 loader limits won't apply because that's only if the file format's detected as PFX.
No, but what I'm saying is I think what you can do then is use the obsolete function that takes the password, which means don't do the second checks within the framework again.
Yeah.
But those wouldn't apply. Those will only kick in if it's the PFX.
But my point is you can put an X509 certificate and specify a password. It works. You
Yeah.
can do that on new X509 certificate too.
Sure.
You can specify a password for an X509 and it won't do anything
It
with
just
the
ignores
password.
it. Yeah.
It just ignores it.
Right. But I'm
Yeah,
saying it won't matter because those checks are after the part where it says go figure out what file format this is so we can call the right loader. They're only in the path when it's already detected it was PFX. But sure, we can ignore that detail. What I'm saying is we have to twice identify the file type. So it will look
Right.
at it, see it's X509, so it doesn't need to throw. Then we'll call the omni function, and it will have to go look at it again to see that it's X509 to figure out how to load it.
Okay.
Um,
So I don't want to rat hole on details too much because that's separate from API design, which is ostensibly what this meeting's for. But Steve, to your question, I think this can all be done by hand waving some implementation stuff away, equivalent to the performance that you get today.
Right. The PFX one, if you pass dangerous no limits, then you'll bypass the limits we added this summer and go straight to the function, which is the same as if you specify a password that bypasses our limits check. So, but I guess let's put it this way: if you call the new APIs, the limits checks we added in the summer don't matter. They will never ever get called.
Mm-hmm. We can make that happen reliably.
And if we build this inbox, we'll even be deleting that code because it'll just be written in terms of this.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't make this, if we make this part of system security cryptography, the code we added this summer gets deleted. It just gets re-implemented in terms of these functions. If this is a perfectly standalone DLL, then we can't do that, and we'll just bypass the new work, which we can do. We know how to do it. What these functions are going to do is they're going to load the PFX, doing as little work as possible, then just repackage it for further processing. But they'll be doing the the limit tracking work along the way, which is like what we have right now. Basically, it's what we have right now lifts up into this function.
Yeah.
That's the easier way to say
And
it.
I don't expect PKCS12 loading to be a very hot path. If you care about PKCS, if you care about certificate and private key loading, then you're going to tear apart the key and certificate from a file format that intentionally is slow to open to get the best perf out of there.
Yeah, by construction, these APIs are intended to be slow.
Certainly, if you say dangerous, no limits.
Even the safe ones, by construction, are intended to take some measurable amount of CPU time.
Because if they're fast, then you get to guess the or then that's a password oracle.
Yeah.
So let me ask, just before we close on the whole factoring thing. So we ended up saying we'd have a brand new assembly as a roundabout way of avoiding adding a few methods that we didn't want to add. Should we revisit that and just add the methods we don't want to add rather than introducing yet another assembly?
I would have two comments. One, we don't know for certain, although we feel pretty confident that these are all of the methods we're going to use. So even if we do make the decision to go back of like, never mind, we want to type forward so that we don't have this, additional assembly, that depends on this API proposal being the only right thing. Like if we ever want to like add another knob to the loader limits class, we're back at the same place. And I don't know for certain that this is going to be what this needs to look like until .NET 50.
In other words, you think we're going to want to rev this with other instance or methods or whatever anyway? You think it's likely?
Well, I don't know about likely, but I mean, using the loader limits as an example, I mean, we were looking at new flags that Windows has added very recently and trying to mimic those into our loader limits. So there is some measure of, a little bit of evolution to some of the PKCS12 stuff. It kind of sounds like we might do it again anyways.
Right. If the past is a measure of the predictor of the future, it's not like all this stuff hasn't changed in the last 20 years. It was changed in the last year, and so we think it's likely it'll change again in the next year, effectively.
Maybe. I mean,
it changed in the last year, but before that, it didn't change since XP.
So I mentioned the DP API thing earlier. I know for a fact that internal teams are using that functionality. And I know for a fact that they're going to run into trouble migrating to this API if we don't include something like that. I don't know if the certificates that they pull are trusted or not, but they are absolutely going to run into problems one way or another. And maybe that means in vNext we have to make API changes to account for them. But that is a guarantee that something is going to have to bend there. So, yeah.
I would say my guess is PKCS12 loader limits won't change between 9 and 13.
Sure.
Like that's just my that it'll be at least 4 years before we would need to change the type. The DP API stuff would probably be a new method group, which would mean we need to change the loader type, but I don't think we'll need to change the limit types. And I would hope that by net 13, net standard 2.0 is dead. I know it won't be true, but I would hope. Because at some point, net standard 2.0 is dead. Right? At some point, we've given up on framework. Net standard 2.0 doesn't matter, and we won't care. Right? It's if you want the feature we added in net 13, upgrade to net 13. And when we get to that world, everything's fine. Until then, I think maybe we'll make some changes and maybe we'll need to do it. But I think that the inbox and Microsoft BCL cryptography, it's an understandable amount of pain, and I think it's the right answer because it'll make the implementation better and it gets us to the place that we want the product to be in 20 years.
Jeremy, I think saying Net Framework will be dead in 4 years is the most optimistic I've ever seen you.
What can I say? I'm an optimistic guy.
Yes, clearly.
Yeah. So I think if we leave load serialized cert and we can decide to expand the name, there was a suggestion in chat that we can alias rename the enum by just adding a new member that has equivalent value and just the longer spelling of the name if we care about the break. But I think if we put the Windows only things in, we won't touch this again unless Windows documents the DP API stuff and we can hook up functions to do it. That'd be the only change I see in the next 4 years. After all, we had this since Net Framework 1.1. So
Yeah.
it's been we've gone on for a long time. It's not a
Yeah,
rapidly evolving space.
We can just take our chances. I would be okay with saying that.
So then, can somebody summarize like how do we ship this thing?
So this type, my suggestion is this type lives in system security cryptography, inbox, net9, Microsoft BCL cryptography, net standard, and associated compat. And if we change it net 10, then I have a bit of work to do.
The other thing that we can do is
hold on. Sorry.
add, yeah.
The assembly you just quoted already exists, correct?
Microsoft BCL cryptography exists. It already does type forwards for, what did we put in it? GCM?
SB 800-108.
Sure.
Yeah.
And the chip's already in box in .NET?
Microsoft BCL cryptography is just the compat sideload thing to get net core behaviors on Net Framework.
Right. So but you said that you want to put it in system.security.cryptography. That's what you said, right?
The real type in Net 9 will be in system security cryptography DLL.
And then the assembly that ships in Microsoft BCL cryptography is also called Microsoft BCL cryptography, right?
Probably.
Yes, it has some type forwards.
But that's just the compat thing. So if you're targeting Net 9, you won't see Microsoft BCL cryptography. If you're targeting Net Standard, you'll have to link in Microsoft BCL cryptography.
Right. So I guess the question is now, what happens if I build for .NET 8? I use Microsoft BCL cryptography and upgrade to .NET 10, right?
Then
or 9, whatever.
Then the Net 9, it'll have Net 9 and say it's a type forward.
Yeah.
No, only when you restore, right? If you just literally do roll forward, then no, right?
If you literally do roll forward, then you'll get the less performant we do the work twice behavior.
Right.
Seems fine.
And that means in .NET 9 we don't have to ship anything in box that does the type forwarding.
Correct. The type forward is only in the NuGet compat package. We're not lying about where it is. We're just exposing it in the side loader.
Right. That seems fine.
Okay. So do we want to put these Windows things back, or do we want to leave them out? If they're in, then the odds that we need to change this in Net 10 go almost to zero. If
what's the downside of leaving them in?
We have to name them.
My concern is that you have a bunch of really, really rare methods next to a bunch of really common methods, and it's going to confuse people.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of people are going to say like, "Oh, I have a JSON serialized certificate for some reason. I'm going to use load serialized cert, and all of a sudden it doesn't do what I want it to do. Because the advantage of the old, Omni function was it just did what you wanted usually.
Right.
And now we're saying no Omni function magic. You need to know what you're doing, and they're going to do X509 certificate loader dot, and then they're going to let IntelliSense tell them what the right thing is, and they're going to I have no idea.
And so, what is the one that you think most people would want?
There's going to be two that people use. They're going to use load X509 certificate, and they're going to use load PKCS12. That there covers almost everything.
I think there are people who call load PKCS7 embedded certificates.
I disagree.
Fair enough.
But okay. I know it's been a pet thing that you've wanted. We don't even have it right now that works XPlat.
We don't. I thought we did the collection one, but not the primary signer.
Maybe
we don't
either
do
way.
either of them.
Yeah.
But I think so. Levi brought up something earlier, which was if we do want these Windows API functions, do we want to put them somewhere else so that we don't have this big IntelliSense explosion of I can load formats, but which one you use is going to be tricky to figure out. Or maybe we're just, I don't know.
I mean, I would honestly say as far as I can tell, they're all prefixes. If you remove load that are on the existing enum, right? So I feel like we can explain what they mean in terms of that enum, right? And I think that's probably going to be good enough. I mean, the only thing is we have things like cert here, which there's no corresponding load cert as far as I can tell, right?
Well, I called it load cert, and then it became load X509 certificate.
The problem is we're now forcing people to contend with spec stuff beyond simply do you want to load a public certificate or do you want to load a certificate with a private key component? That's a very simple question for most people to answer, and I think most people can successfully answer that question. If you start asking what's the actual file format that you expect to load, I think people are going to fail if you ask them that question.
But I mean, that's the design of the type, right? That's not a function of do we expose these four methods or not. I mean, you basically tell people I want you to pick these things, and if the thing you picked is not the thing you got, then we fail, right? So in a sense, that is the design, right?
But we're asking the type. If you remove all the Windows stuff, the type literally comes down to public or private. What are you trying to do? If you add all of this stuff back in, then it comes to public, private, or these 5 other things. What are you trying to do?
Right.
And I think that's where the pit of failure comes in.
Yeah. So what I went for here is the notion of everything that the function does right now that it should do on this type. One of the other things that came up in discussion is, so to go with the things that we never actually got around to making work on Linux, these PKCS7 primary signer and embedded certificates, these are just we could cut these and say use sign CMS, because sign CMS is the correct class for loading a PKCS7 signed object, and then you can read its certs collection and you can say .signers sub-0 .certificate. These are just accelerators for those behaviors, and we could say there's already a way to do it. 1 line turns into 3. Write your own function in terms of that if you want. That was a suggestion Morgan had, was just cut these because they're redundant with other types. And so we could slim all this down. We could yank out the Windows things. We could yank out PKCS7, and then now it really is load a single certificate and load a PKCS12 collection or single certificate, and you're done. And if we want to put the Windows stuff in, we make a new sibling type called load Windows certificate formats or something. Is an option.
Yeah.
We'd be permanently cutting the PKCS7 with that plan. But again, it's signed CMS. It's 3 lines of code. So that would
You could
slim it down significantly to no private key and yes private key. And then yes private key has single thing or collection.
Yeah, I think that what Jeremy just described is like easily the 99% use case, easily. I I could imagine putting in another like loader extended static class where a lot of these much less common APIs exist. But if we're introducing a static class that we expect most people to get directed to, like the two big things are the things that really belong on there. I'm just going for simplicity, honestly.
Sure.
So it looks like what we currently have on the type is like 8 distinct method names, right?
Probably. 1, 2,
And so-
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. Oh, 9.
And so
Oh, but those
I
are the
just
same thing.
posted them into the chat. So like I feel like, so I don't disagree with anything that Levi was saying in the abstract. I think like specifically though, if we just remove 4 methods from the 8 times 4 overloads or whatever, right? That to me does not make a material difference. Like if that just makes things simpler because if we just everything is there, then I'd rather keep them. If the argument is you really want to, basically there's only 2 choices people should make, and we should have an API surface that is conducive to that, then yeah, the 8 method groups you have right now is not doing that. I would agree with that. That's kind of like, but that might just be a naming thing, right? I mean, maybe that's just you need to find better names for those things, or have prefixes that kind of segregate that in an easier way or whatever, right? But like that's what I'm saying. To me, just removing one group from this thing is not going to, I think, suddenly materially improve the usability of this type.
Right. So the super slim proposal would be load X509 certificate, load PKCS12, so these collection variants, and load PKCS12 single. It would be 3 method groups.
Yeah, I
So
I think those 3 are easily understandable
And
by the layperson.
Also, with those names,
I mean, we can then talk about those names.
Yeah, I have opinions on names.
Naming aside, I think those 3 method groups are the things, again, 99% use case, and people can easily understand what each one does.
Right.
It comes down to public or private.
I mean, it sounds like earlier on in the previous discussions, we've kind of already come to the conclusion that we're okay with people saying, if you have to continue using the constructor, then continue to do so by just suppressing the obsolescence. If we're going down that as a acceptable path, then I don't see the need for the full completion of all of the Windows APIs. I think a lot of that was originally spurred by the idea that the constructors would really never be used ever again. If we're kind of walking back away from that, then sure.
I'm not sure I think that's great. I think I'm okay with saying there's a point in time where we may not have parity. So the only way you can do things is by suppressing the obsolescence. I think a design in the long run that says, well, you just have to know what you want and then you suppress it or not. I think you make it almost very difficult for people to understand, right? Because then when you're living in this world, it's like, well, why don't I always suppress and just say, fuck it, I don't have to think about it, right?
Then what you could do is you could literally have an API which is just like load raw, I don't care what it is, and it's supported OS Windows only, and it literally is the Omni function, and the Omni function exists only on Windows.
That seems like a reasonable thing.
And we tell people, like, don't use this unless you really know what you're doing and you really need compat.
Dangerous, load and shut up.
Yeah, dangerous, load raw.
And yeah, I mean, that seems a bit more reasonable than the sometimes you suppress, sometimes you don't, right? That I think to me, suppressions make sense for things like, well, this API only exists on Windows, or this experimental where you know exactly what you're opting into.
Mm-hmm.
Versus this one is more like, well, depending on what you use, sometimes you don't want to suppress, and it's like that in a space where it's already nuanced, like you basically ask for a lot, I think.
What we would do is we would document this, like this calls PFX import search store, passing these flags. This is the only thing it does. And it will never do anything other than call that Win32 API. That is the behavior for the end of time.
I see.
We could literally call it PFX import search store if you really wanted to. Because
Well,
it
I
would be a
think-
dumb shim around it.
Well, I think that you want to convey the dangerous portion, right? Similar to the dangerous no limits, right? You want to say like, well, if you do this, whatever in the format is what we do,
Right.
which is probably not what you want.
I mean, PKCS12 import search store. If you're saying we should add dangerous be the omni function, like that's not the one that is the omni function. Crypt decode object is the omni function until it returns this was a PFX, and then it has to turn around and call PFX import search store.
Yeah.
And from the security perspective, from security, calling the omni is not bad unless it's a PFX.
Correct.
But for a protocol compliance, like an implementation of SSL stream that was entirely in managed code, which will be over my dead body, when it's reading the certificate heading, it would need to call load certificate. It's a violation of the protocol to accept a Windows serialized certificate there, or a PFX there, or right.
Correct.
This is the one and only format that is allowed at this place in this protocol. And most people who are calling X509 certificate 2 of bytes want this highlighted function. Like, it is specifically, I expect an X509 certificate, not something that can be eventually turned into one, but something that actually is one. And anytime they get any of these other things, they get surprise behavior.
I mean, at that point, like, just consider calling it load.
Yeah, that's well, load for which? The omni function or X509?
No, what
The public
Jeremy
one.
just said, like the general usability rule is like the thing that you expect most people to use should have the simplest name. Right now, the problem is they all have complicated names, so they all look equally bad, right? So like that's kind of like, okay, now you have to read, right? But if you say, look, like load is the one you probably want because it's the most conservative. It just only loads the thing that is the thing. Everything else you need to do some reading if you understand what you got. I mean, that seems like a reasonable design at that point, right?
The problem is it depends on what you're loading. People are going to want to load in either a PFX or they're going to want to load an X509. They generally don't want to load either one if they're in a managed SSL stream implementation, which I'm going to start writing just for Jeremy.
Fantastic.
I only ever want an X509 certificate. Other people are going to say, hey, I want to load, a PFX because I'm trying to start a web server. If it's just called load, they're not going to know, which load you want to do depends on your context. The original name that I had suggested was load X509 because I thought it was pretty obvious that it's loading certificates because it's called X509 certificate loader. And X509 certificate loader.load X509 certificate just sounds like, a little too much to me.
Yep. That's why I said the first one needs the most love with the name.
I think the first one, even if you call it load, the fact that the first one doesn't have any overloads that take a password should be a pretty obvious indication it's public only.
Unless you're using a passwordless PFX, which a lot of people do, as we found.
Yes. And those people are going to, in their testing environment, see that their web server doesn't start, and then they're going to know what to do. Like, no one's going to run into a problem in production here. Like, the only time you'll run into a problem in production is if you literally didn't ever hit F5 and test it yourself.
You need to go work some other places for a while, man.
Wow.
I have been guilty of that, by the way.
So like,
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So one suggestion from chat is we did it wrong when we put them in the same type. That
I had thought about it, and that would also make the type forwarding story a lot more palatable in the future, where that way we can introduce non-type forwarded things as we need to do it. But
yeah. So
that's just
X509 certificate loader dot load, PKCS12 certificate loader dot load, which may need to be load single and load.
I honestly
Collection.
disagree with that because it's like you just you basically now just move the problem space, right? So right now the problem is you dot into this type, you see all the load overloads or the method groups, and you have to pick, right? And we say that's difficult, and now we are saying, oh, we just changed the type names, which now you replace the problem with system.security.cryptography dot. Now you have to pick the type name, and now because now they're all suffixes from each other, right? Or because they all have different prefixes. Now you can't even see them all on one screen, so now it's even harder to pick the one you want to have.
Yep.
And so I think in general, like if you want people to make a decision, you kind of want to coalesce the decisions into one place where you can just dot, and then the only thing you see are the choices you're supposed to make, not unrelated shit that has nothing to do with your choices, because it just makes it more difficult. But I think what Levi was saying is that when you look at chat, the 8 method groups, we don't think of them as all equally plausible, right? We basically think there's the 2 of them that are much, much more plausible than others. And I think the question is just, can you come up with a naming convention that kind of helps you do that? And maybe the answer to that is you don't. You just give the other ones maybe a different naming convention that is just really ugly.
Right. So the reduced to 3, again ignoring overloads.
Right.
Would be that.
Yes.
naming aside, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I like it,
All right,
Frederick. Esoteric
so what-
certificate formats loader.
So how do we get to the other ones then? What's the suggestion? You just don't have the other ones at all, or are you saying
Right.
well, we
So the PKCS7 ones, that's literally
That's signed CMS.
somewhere in here. I should have it. It's literally these 2 lines of code followed by did you want the first one or the second one? Like, this is the PKCS7 embedded certificates, and this is PKCS7 primary signer. Like, there's existing API. We can cut this from this proposal and say call the other API. If you don't like writing 3 lines of code when you could have written 1, write a helper function.
why can't we just take the existing ones that you have and just insert signed CMS before their name, so they're all like load signed CMS blah? Because then they're all relatively ugly, but they're all grouped
Signed
together by that
CMS is a different kind of spec that you can use to get the PKCS7 certificate. So what would we call it? Like load signed CMS signer certificate?
Right, because PKCS7 is a spec that talks about both signed CMS and encrypted, or signed CMS and envelope CMS, and then a bunch of other things we never got around to writing. So this is called PKCS7 here because it's called PKCS7 here, but it really means PKCS7, which is also known as CMS, signed data. So our signed CMS is what this means when it says PKCS7. Because it means the signed data portion of the PKCS7 spec. And if you don't understand it, that's fine, because no one does.
It looks like Kevin's ears are about to fall off.
Because PKCS7 is not a certificate format. It is a thing that can have certificates in multiple places. And this is you wanted it from place A, and this is you wanted it from place B. which my code sample of like they're a three-liner only because sign CMS you have to say new and then load. So it's new, load, which thing did you want? So this one we can cut. The Authenticode one, there's no other way to do it, but it's also not great, and I know people use it, but it's not super popular. Serialized store and serialized cert, there are probably 12 people in the world who care. If we cut those, we could add them later with X509 esoteric format loader. Like we could solve the problem after the fact. Parallel type, new methods here, whatever. But
I do like the simpler overload decision making where if you go back to your other window, I don't know where it went, the VS Code window. Again, naming aside, I think a lot of people, when they look at that, they'll have a pretty good sense of what they should be picking.
What is PFX? Is that the first or the second one?
The second one's PKCS12 and PFX.
Yeah. PKCS 12 is the standard number that described the PFX format. They're synonymous.
Yeah, I was just commenting in YouTube chat, like, normally I would prefer having PFX somewhere in the method name, but here I don't really care all that much because PKCS12 A is more correct, and B, like, if you look at the docs for the type, like, it will literally say somewhere in there, this is what you want. So the learning curve is, like, a very small mound.
Yeah, so this is a public-private, and then if you have private, do you want one or many?
Yeah.
And that's the whole decision tree with this type. Or with it reduced like this.
I think this works.
And then now we just get to talk about names, and we're technically over time.
I think these names also work, to be honest.
So why can't you, like, if you write public and private, why don't you just name them like this? Load public and private, load public and private collection or whatever.
They don't exactly correspond to public and private always. It's just a very useful way to think of it.
Yeah.
So I guess if we're getting into naming, what does load PKCS 12 single certificate do if it's a PKCS 12 that contains a certificate and no private key?
Loads that certificate.
Yeah, because it's a valid PKCS 12 certificate.
Okay, good. We're on the same page then there. So it's not really fair to say it's public plus private.
Right.
It's
Right.
probably a thing that has a private
Yes.
key.
So this function is the exact same thing as if you give a PFX/PKCS12 payload into the X509 certificate to constructor, which is there's a defined order of traversal, and using that order, the first one it finds that has an associated private key wins. If nothing had a private key, then the first thing wins, and if there was nothing, then throw, because it's a constructor and it can't return null.
Presumably, if you specify a password and it doesn't have a private portion, it's still like what does it mean? Presumably, what is the password for? I assume it protects the private key, right?
There's also a MAC. So
Yeah.
most of the time, regardless of whether or not you have a private key in there, there's probably a MAC. You can have a PFX with no secrets and no MAC, and then the password really doesn't matter. But there are few and far tools in between that will produce those that way. Like you can do it with the OpenSSL command line, but you have to give it, very explicit things, saying as much.
By default, on Mac OS and on Windows, the certificate, even though it's public data, they will encrypt it if you're writing a PFX because somebody thought that was a good idea in 1995.
It's a checkbox now.
Now it's a checkbox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It used to not be a checkbox. It used to just be done. So
Do we really? I think the vast majority of people are going to be just loading a PKCS12 as a single certificate because they're going to want to specify it for like a web server. Should we flip that to be one, load PKCS12 to be load the single, and then make the second one load PKCS12? Yeah, there you go.
Sure.
That's kind of what. That was my other suggestion. Yeah.
Because there are many valid scenarios for having a PKCS12 collection, but if you have a PKCS12 collection, you certainly know what you're doing at this point, and you're probably going to know which API to use.
And the first one, we still don't want to call load. We still believe that that name is the right name.
I want to call it load x509. That's my suggestion. Certificate's redundant because it's in the type name, and x509 implies a certificate, kind of.
I mean, if you're an X509 certificate loader and you call .load, what would you expect to load? I mean,
well, this kind of goes back to the whole .NET Framework 1.0. If we could do it all from scratch, there would be no such thing as a private key on X509 certificate 2. The fact that .NET kind of smushes them together in the first place is a little weird, but we have to live with that. So if we didn't have that, then yes, I'd say just call it load. But for better or for worse, X509 certificate 2 does ingest multiple formats, and that's what .NET developers have come to expect. So if we're going to if we're making the loader APIs picky about what the format is, I think we need to specify which one it is.
Right, but I think my point is that what you just said is true, right? Like the .NET type name X509 certificate encompasses multiple formats, but it also happens to be specific format. So like if you call something load that thing, the question is, well, the type name is the same thing as the method name, so it's still anybody's best guess whether people expect it to be a format or just referring to the type that you're getting back, right? So like it is the ambiguity in the type name that's the problem. That's why I'm saying, to me, putting X509 in the method name when it's already in the type name, to me, it literally makes no difference. Like it doesn't explain it. I would just say
yes, but I think
to
it's useful to disambiguate it from PKCS12. That's all.
Well, I think if you just call it load, what will end up happening is it's a simpler name, so more people will call it, right? Which is kind of, that goes back to like, what do we expect most people to do? If that's not what we want, then yes, you want some other qualifier, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with Amo here. I think it is the more common scenario.
I mean, literally, the / comment could just say loads an X509 certificate in that format and nothing else, right? And I mean, like, that would be the way to do it. But similar to what Levi said, right? Like, if you have it in a different format, the thing will blow up, right? Presumably, the exception will tell you, sorry, this is not in the format that I expected it to be in. Please try another one, right?
But Emo, you and I apparently need to get out into the industry more often and observe these types of failures for ourselves.
Right.
No,
So
I mean, we do know from usability studies that when the exception message is actionable and tells people like you're holding it wrong and here's what you need to do, it does work. Like, I mean, that does tend to do a better job than whatever method naming or documentation you could have did.
And to be fair, we actually can pretty easily detect that within these methods and throw a very useful exception saying, hey, you're trying to load a PFX, you really want this other method instead, here are the docs for it.
Right. So for the lack of inspiration in the name, so this is the RFC, the real authoritative standard is X.509, which is by ITU, but honestly everybody just looks at the RFC. Sorry, ITU. But the file format itself is just called certificate.
Mm-hmm.
This is the data file. This is the data type name. It's just certificate, and that led to complication in naming.
I mean, if you call it load certificate versus load PFX, so load PKCS12, I think that's still fine because you're still saying it's a format, right? I think, to me, the problem is to name the thing exactly like the .NET type name. I think that's kind of why I think it's redundant and it doesn't really help people, because you would have to somehow tell people like, I don't mean the type name, I mean the format, right? Which I don't think that's how that works.
Right. So there's load certificate, load x509, load x509 certificate, and load. And
I don't
is
have enough preference.
Like another question is like, when you write files on disk, like what extensions do they typically use?
A lot. It depends on whether it's dir or if it's pem, and it depends on what operating system you're using. Some use SIR, some use CRT, some use pem.
some use dir.
There really is no great file extension for all of that. There's probably half a dozen.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is still that you guys suck at naming, basically. And
Well,
you
that's
guys,
what
I mean,
happens when you
recruit the
pull up
community at large.
RFCs and say, "Oh, that's where I'm going to start naming things from." But
Yeah, I was experimenting with certutil yesterday, and I noticed that it created .cer files and .crt files, and I couldn't figure out a rhyme or reason as to why it was creating one versus the other. I don't know why even our own tooling doesn't use a single extension, but whatever.
I can tell you that my biggest pain point with all of that shit is like, when you buy a certificate, the thing you need on Azure is not the thing they give you. So it's up to you to make the thing to get the other thing. And it seems the instructions on how to do that either keep changing or I'm just too dumb to remember them. And I'm like, every time it's like, fuck this. And now I'm just using Azure. I'm just saying, manage certificates, fuck this. I'm not doing this myself anymore.
So
like,
they've upsold you, is what you're saying. They've done their jobs.
well, it's for free, so it's like actually I pay less money now. But I think to me that kind of like echoes is like, if you're not an expert in this domain, it's fucking redonkulous, right? So like that's why, I don't know. Like naming seems to be not something that anybody considered here.
yeah, I like these names. I don't like just the bare load, because I do think it sounds ambiguous as to what it is, because this thing does load multiple formats. Load certificate seems fine. Load PKCS 12 makes the most sense. So I think this is reasonable.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Nice.
reduce
Works
it
for
to
me.
these things.
And the rest is just fuck you. You don't get it.
The rest is, yeah.
No,
like
let's burn that bridge when we come to it.
the So again, PKCS 7. If you want these, your file format safe loading option is to switch to using the signed CMS type.
Yeah.
If you're using it on Linux, at least if you want this one, you already had to do, because we've had a to-do item since Core FX 1 of make this work on Linux.
Yeah.
And Kevin has said like 3 different versions. I'll totally do it before release. And he did just what I did for the first 3 versions of .NET Core. I'll totally have this done by the next release. So, right. So the only weird ones that are being left out are the Windows proprietary things, and we can burn that bridge when we get there.
Yeah.
I did have.
Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead. I just had something unrelated.
I have a thought on the API shape for the loaders. With the read-only span version of PFX and certificate, we have in the past gotten feedback about whether or not these APIs throw if there's trailing data. Right now, the constructor will permit trailing data after like the dir format. We were inconsistent about it at first on Mac OS because we implemented it in managed code. We would basically say read the whole dir blob, if there's trailing data then throw. And then somebody said, well, that's not consistent with Windows. Windows permits trailing data. So now we allow trailing data. So my question is, do we need an out int bytes consumed on the read-only span version, because we've done that in the past for other load blobby things? And what does byte array do if there's trailing data?
So we are actually working with the servicing team right now to block, straight up prohibit trailing data in the existing X509 certificate 2 type. That change hasn't gone in yet, but it should come in sometime in the next few weeks. So I would just say the same here, just straight up prohibit it. If you see it, it fails.
So what about the PIM loader? Will it allow pre-pending and appending data and just look for a PIM blob?
When I say it fails, I mean it chops off everything after the trailing data. It doesn't flow it down to any of the anything else in the system.
So you're
right, and
right. So you're permitting trailing data. You're just ignoring.
We're just not doing anything with it.
We're not doing anything with it. We're ignoring it. We're not allowing it to flow down.
That's fine, and but that's permitting trailing data. What I am saying is, what used to happen is if there was any trailing data, even if it was like if you had two X509 certificates in dir form right after each other, then it would just throw saying like, oh, the outer dir sequence said that the certificate is X number of bytes, but it turns out it was X plus 1. Should it throw? Some people like to just when they have like binary formats, they just don't pre-slice the data. So I'm asking, if there's any trailing data, whether or not we load, I very much assume we are going to ignore trailing data. Yeah. But if there's any trailing data, do we throw? And if we don't, do callers want to know how much data they actually consumed so that they can slice?
I would say the answer is don't do that. I would think it would be okay to leave it ambiguous, as long as we go one of those two routes. We ignore it or we throw.
And if we don't throw, is there a good reason to expose how much we read? Because we do that in other
like when we wrote
things.
I
think PKCS 12 info does that.
Yeah, it does.
And load RSA private key. Or import RSA private key. Yeah, so when we did the private key file formats, we did out bytes read in case it was. So if you were doing, you're here and the next thing is an RSA private key, but you don't know how long it is. We told you how long it was. And then you get this is how much data we consumed. Do with that what you will. To allow for pipelining. I can honestly say I've never used it.
I don't think anyone will use it. That's the thing.
I usually just out underscore it. If I do check it, then the only thing I do is make sure that it was equal to my input length, and if not, throw. So I've never needed it for the streaming scenario.
That's why I brought it up, though, is like you mentioned a scenario before of you want to make sure you're conforming to a protocol or a specification. Like if you're, again, implementing managed SSL and there's trailing data after the certificate, you can't really say that, you're, following the spec.
Right.
If there's trailing data, maybe.
So you could add an option to default that says allow trailing data, true or false.
But
default it to false.
But that's for PFX.
Yeah.
This if you're writing managed SSL stream, you're loading X509.
I don't think it matters enough, to be honest.
No, but that again, so the people who need the strict inline protocol conformance then need to flip over to do. Well, honestly, they'd need to flip over anyway because they need to block PIM.
Yeah.
So they'd want to call ASN reader read a single thing and make sure that's the length of the payload they're expecting. Which sucks. But if we break this apart of do you expect PIM or binary data, then people are going to shit a brick and call the old thing. So.
So I have one more question. So if we cut the other APIs, by the way, keep in mind if you want to bring them back, you have to bring them back on a new type.
That should be okay.
or
Yeah, I'm just
we do
saying, like,
convoluted things. We can make it
Yeah.
work. Because we could just say, on net 9, fine, we don't use the embedded thing anymore. If you come from the future package, we're going to rewrite it in terms of the public API the same way we did for net 8. Like, we would just
So
bypass the existing type.
I didn't follow that. Like, the problem is you can't ship an OOP type that you inbox and later on add to the OOP type. That's a contractual break of versioning, no matter how you slice it.
Fair enough. I think it can work, but we can say we just won't add to
The
this
only
type. We'd make a new parallel type.
The only way this works is if the type itself is oobable, right? Which is basically all of system text.json. Because at that point you just say the inbox is, there's an inbox assembly, but it's an older version, and so the OOP one was the newer one. But you don't get to do that if the shape of the assemblies differs because you inbox it in a different assembly with
Right.
non-type forwarding.
But in this case, the assembly this lives in is not the same as the package identity assembly. So Microsoft BCL cryptography can add new members on the type and then change the package description to say, instead of using a type forward, here's an actual working implementation of this type. For net
Well, the problem is you can't change the path. So the problem is once you inbox a type,
yep,
you can't add to the OOP type because the OOP type can't replace the inbox type.
You can.
So you get to do that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You get to do it on a new type, and then the new type can be in the NuGet package. But if you inbox the type and you rely on type forwarding, that type can never get new members.
I think
So
it
what's
works
wrong
because it's a static type. You can never have an instance and need to have instance equality. So we don't care that type of A and type of B are different. We can let them actually be from different assemblies in the same process.
Yeah.
I think
But
it works in our
also-
case, but we'll work it out later when we get there.
Well,
Why
then you
can't
don't
we
get to use
just-
type forwarding in the first place. But yes, like, I mean, all I'm saying is you can't change your name. Your like, you either say we're unifying the types or we don't unify the types.
Yeah.
If you do unify the types and you type forward, then you never get to add you don't get to add members to it.
Like, I think it works, but I would need a beer and a whiteboard, and so we'll
Yeah.
get together at some point, and I'll tell you why I think it works.
Also, if these are esoteric members, we're totally free just to say these members are .NET 10 and above only.
Yeah, that's
Like that would be
which
the
is another way to
easiest
say
way to
you
solve
don't get them move,
Yeah.
right?
right.
That would be by far the easiest way to solve it. Net 10 and above only, the end.
Yep.
Because prior to that, you're probably going to be able to call the obsolete APIs anyway, so who cares?
That works.
Okay,
Yeah.
so load X509 certificate becomes load certificate. Load PKCS 12 single becomes load PKCS. The old load PKCS is now load collection. I didn't really get to talk about the fact that we have collection into and collection from, which means I think that we really need to finish this off next time, but I'll bring in the slimmer version
Yeah.
for us to talk about.
Yeah. Also, the exception that you have at the bottom of serializable doesn't actually affect the public API surface.
It doesn't? So we only need the net implementation to say that it's serializable in the impl?
Yeah, it would be an implementation detail. It wouldn't be in the ref assemblies.
Fair enough. And that's not a thing that our API compat's going to yell at us about for being inconsistent?
I don't see why it would.
That just depends on whether or not serializable is an attribute we told it to care about. So,
It probably
I'd have
does.
to go check.
But it's a zero
It's
attribute.
not. It's
right?
not
So-
supposed to.
yeah, I mean, and if nothing else, we can just suppress it. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you guys for a lively discussion, and wow, 17 people watching on the stream.
I really
Thank you
want
for
to
it.
approve the string builder one, but maybe next time.
Yeah. So I will doodle the notes in this after the meeting that I'm supposed to be in that started 25 minutes ago, and then this will, I guess, just still be at the top of the agenda next time. So.
It works.
All right. Reminder, everyone online, we're not currently having Thursday meetings, so we will see you next Tuesday at 10 a.m. in Redmond. That's our same .NET time here on our same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.